the interfaces. We implement the interface. Each of the implementations, we see the user registry implements the user registration service interfaces, and then straightforward. We annotated service because this is our business logic in for our service implementations. That's why the service annotation. Those are new into Spring Boot, or the annotation about which annotation, how we can use it. I had a screencast. In the previous screencast, I discussed a little bit more detail for all the annotation, how can you use it and where you can use those annotations. So you see that we private auto-aware, our defined repositories, that's we already defined here, the repositories, and call default repository to make the find all with the paging object with pageable objects, and then also find all only the not the page with the paging informations with not only the content information. And then here we create the object very straightforward, the create objects, and then update the user registrations. We pass the user registration ID, then user registration objects, and then update the respective information. So we find the user registration ID. After that, we mapped it user registration and build the new record, new information, new values with the existing values. If the existing values there, then it will be stay as it is. It is the new values coming is override your new values. That really straightforward. The basic CRUD operation or CRUD operations. So delete functions, we just find the user registration ID and find the user registration and delete the user registration ID. Very straightforward call of the operation. The JPA repositories or standard repository paging and sorting, or CRUD repository or JPA repository standard functionality is there. So user role implementation is very easy, and they expect the same thing. We implement the interfaces, and what we needed to auto-aware the user role repository and user registration repository, and then we use the same very straightforward functionalities to find all the user registration roles and find only the content, and then get all the user registration role by user ID, and then create the user role based on the user registered user ID, and then pass the user role object itself. So it's find the user registration ID and find it. If it's find it, then fill the object itself and save the user registration role for respective user registration ID. So this is all the Java documentation. How can you see it is I just started the implementation, but you can write down a lot of things that every function need to discuss, and then you can also do it such a way depending how. But this is like the professional project template structure. That's what we did last 10 years or 15 years. How can you professionally structure the projects, and how can you defend and develop the really professional way? How can you implement those things? So just like initial structure, but it is professional structure that you need to be follow for your professional career in your company. So after registration, to pass the user registration ID, user role ID, and so on and so forth, and then we find the user registration ID and then user role ID and update the information if it is not present, and then fill the new record of that one. So they're very straightforward CRUD operation for these cases. So we implement these implementations and user so only the two implementation. There is no profile implementation. I believe there's nothing. It is just started. Just there is one informations to the user details. The implementation only one single function that we did here. So only one implementation functions is there. So we implement the interface. We implement the classes, the methods that we need with the respective repositories that we defined into our interface definitions. And then we use our repositories. That's what we defined as out of our model definitions. So as a straightforward the implementations. When the model definition, repository definition done, service implementation is done, then we need to define the controller part. Before we start the controller part, we need to discuss about a little bit more about the Swagger UI. So Swagger UI, basically you see here you have a Swagger 2 version and OpenAPI 3, meaning Swagger 3 version, the Swagger OpenAPI specifications. For this case and the previous case, I used also Swagger 2 and also the mixture of the OpenAPI 3. For this case, I just simply use the OpenAPI 3 a specification with the Swagger 3 annotations. So we define the configurations like the Swagger UI dependency. We inject the Swagger API, the pom.xml files, and we just like this is see the Flyway database migrate dependency here, and then Swagger UI. What do I did it? Yes, you see the I use the Spring Dog minus Spring API OpenAPI UI, and it's the versions that need the Swagger UI. So dependency is injected into the pom.xml files, and then those are new into the how can you create the Spring Boot application. Just Google it, and there is a special project like Spring Initializer. You can build the projects and import the project into the respective IDE. I did it, and after that I just added like our dependency into the pom.xml. I added like the OpenAPI APIs and Swagger, and also the Flyway database migration did. Other things I just take this from the Spring Boot Initializer projects. So you got the idea how can you build the projects. So after the dependency injected, then we have the Spring Boot configuration, and you need to configure the OpenAPI. So it's a very straightforward configuration object, and this is the class information. Is a bean automated created with meta data informations. It's really really straightforward. So here we set some values from the application.yml file with the value annotations. If I go to the value annotations, so we define some value annotation. We see we have a Spring Boot Spring Dog Swagger UI enable true application description and version 1.2.7, and depending which version we are running. So I will do the test with the version number what I did, and how can you run these versions into the Docker and Docker Compose files. So we did it the configurations. We set two values to read from the application.yml file, set the values into the meta informations, and then add this, and it automatically create the OpenAPI that one container beans, or Spring Boot container beans created, and it has a more possibility. You can define additional bean for each of the grouping functionalities for your REST APIs. So I just simply started how can you group by your REST APIs. So then after the grouping the REST APIs, we have some additional information. Then we can go to the controller part. We see the controller part that we just like simply define the REST controllers, request mappings. This is our base URL path, this directory, and then we have defined some text like OpenAPI, and then we define some static values into our other class. You can also map it, or you can write down another properties files, but this I found is really one of the way how can you define your static values into the other class and inject the values where you need it, just like globally to set these values. If you change some changes here, this automatically change inside your application how many places you use it. That's why I said like one sort of semi-global settings of your the properties or application information. So that means, and then we have a definition of your definition of your OpenAPI configuration. We define the also configuration part, some part of the information. That's what you saw in here, the definition, like user registration definition, how many description you need to do. It's depending on you how it's described. You see some part I started, but it's up to you how you can handle those things together. And the description of your file system, so you describe each of the method, but I started how can you do it, how can you start these configurations, and so on and so forth.